Good afternoon, everybody. Just making sure everybody's got in okay. I'll just give it another minute just in case anybody's still trying to find the link. Okay. I think everybody who's joined already is in, so I'll get started. So, welcome everybody. Welcome to this lunch and learn, which is called Communicating Well with People in Crisis. My name's Marie. I am one of the lead consultants at ADR. I'm also the head of training and development. I've been a mediator now for 12 years and I specialise in mental health, neurodiversity, and basically anything that affects the brain's way of communicating, affects the brain's way of connecting with people, the kind of things that influence how we connect with people. So that's why my specialist area, which is why I've been asked to deliver this lunch and learn today. So I'm just going to start sharing my slides. Just bear with me 1 second to make sure that works. There we go. So far, so good. We had some tech issues yesterday. So far, so good today. Like I said, this is the Communicating Well with People in Crisis. And what I am particularly going to cover today is around how to communicate calmly and effectively. So I'm going to focus on how to communicate calmly and effectively with people in distress or crisis. And we're also going to talk a little bit about how vulnerability, neurodiversity and trauma can affect how people communicate. And I'm also going to focus on a few tips for you today in terms of those human first approaches, if I can put my teeth in today. So that's essentially what we're going to cover in terms of this session today. Please feel free to pop any questions, thoughts or perspectives in the chat as I am talking. I will make sure there's some space at the end of the session if there are any specific questions that anybody has or anything that anybody wants to reflect on in terms of what I cover today. And it is an interactive session, so there will be a spot at the end if anybody does want to take themselves off mute and share anything or ask anything. So there will be that space at the end of this session. But it's a 30-minute session, so I'm going to crack straight on. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by setting the scene a little bit. But I do need to just sort of mention at this point that this isn't about diagnosing or giving you a therapy model. So I do need to give a bit of a disclaimer at this point. It's not a diagnostic framework I'm going to talk about. It's about communication and support and how we can support somebody regardless actually of knowing what's maybe specifically going on in terms of diagnosis. So that's the lens that I want to make sure that we follow as we go through today. But first things first, what are we actually talking about? So the word crisis, we can often imagine something dramatic, obvious, extreme, something that when we see it, it's like that person's in crisis. But unfortunately, crisis shows up in so many different ways. And it's actually quite rare that they're loud ways that people show up. So in terms of the kind of things that might be going on, we might see shutdown. Somebody goes quiet, goes still, or they seem to disappear from a conversation. That could be a text conversation, it could be on a video call, it could be in terms of the conversation itself, they just go quiet in terms of a face-to-face conversation. Sometimes it can look like panic. Their breathing might change, their urgency goes up, or they seem unable to settle, or they start to get a little bit fidgety. It could be a little bit louder. It could be anger. It could be frustration, aggression. It might look like sharp, defensive or reactive responses, often out of proportion in terms of the situation as well. It can look like distress. This is probably the one we're most likely to recognise. So there may be tears, there may be a visible overwhelm, or you can clearly see they're struggling to hold themselves together. And it can also look like confusion. This is the one that I tend to have the most when I'm feeling like this, because the crisis is something that unfortunately I have lived experience of. But in terms of that, confusion for me is the biggest one. I can't process, I can't make a decision, I can't take in what's being said, or I just completely lose the thread of the conversation completely. And it looks almost like shutdown alongside that confusion. So when I'm talking about crisis in terms of this session, I'm not talking about sort of the biggest, most obvious moments. I'm talking about the point where somebody's usual coping capacity has been overwhelmed. So that's what we're talking about in terms of crisis. So it matters because if we know how to spot crisis when it's loud, we often miss a lot of the quieter signs. So this is about sort of bearing in mind that, every crisis has started from somewhere probably a lot smaller and a lot quieter. And what I mean by this is that crisis rarely comes out of nowhere. So I've got 6 steps here just to be mindful of that somebody may have already gone through by the time you actually see the obvious signs of crisis. So really, really simply, the 6 steps. The first one is that pressure builds. I'm going to talk a little bit more about stress in a second, but I'm sure we've all felt like this. I know the world at the moment is challenging enough that we're all feeling under pressure. And what we mean by pressure building is that stress is rising, but the recovery time that we have is not keeping up. So there's a big imbalance there between the level of stress somebody's feeling and the capacity they have to recover. Once that capacity narrows, we have a lot less space to think, which means we have a lot less space to respond well. So our capacity to respond well becomes challenging. And that's when we see our communication change. That's when we start to see the cracks in terms of how somebody communicates with us or how we communicate with somebody else. That might be a slight change in words or tone or behaviour, those little shifts that your brain might even recognise. You might even kind of go, I wonder what's going on with them today. But we don't always follow it up. This is the point that for somebody who is in this position, their sense of safety starts to drop. So if anybody was on the webinar that we did sort of an hour or so ago, the panel that we did a couple of hours ago, we talked about how to create safe spaces. This is the point where that space does not feel safe. It may feel threatening or out of control. And to say something feels threatening feels a little bit out of proportion. I'll explain what I mean by threat in a couple of slides' time. But what happens when we feel under threat, we automatically go into protection. We go into survival mode. We go into self-protection mode. And what happens is that self-protection mode then drives our response. We're focused on survival only, not communicating well with the person who's in front of us. Yeah. And what that often means is that's the point where that overwhelm is close. That's the point where that crisis situation is about to come really to the forefront, probably come a bit more obvious. But those crisis situations, they rarely come out of nowhere. Yeah, so when we see that person react angrily in a team meeting, there's been a build up to that. When we've heard somebody slam the phone down, when we try and have a conversation with them about whatever it is in terms of their issue or complaint they've raised, there's been a build up to that, but we don't always notice it. So I said I'd come back to stress. I do want to pick on that pressure builds point again, because if we can do something at this point for ourselves and to support other people, you can often avert the severity of a crisis, if not the crisis itself. And I'm going to use a really, really simple analogy that you may have actually heard of before. And this is the stress bucket analogy. So as human beings, we all have a metaphorical bucket. I have to use a bucket because I'm a northerner. So it's not a container, it's a bucket where I live. And this is one of the most useful ways I know to explain how we can get close to the edge without even realising we're there. So we don't always realise how full our buckets are. So we're carrying around this bucket. Everybody's bucket is a different size. Some people have a bucket the size of a thimble, which means they have a low capacity for stress. Some people have a bucket the size of a reservoir or a lake, which means we have a huge capacity to stress. What that means is we can take on a lot of stress before we reach that crisis point. Every single day, everyday stresses, water flows into that bucket. That can be worry about your health, relationship strain, your workload, tension, deadlines, the news. Anything could drip into that bucket. It could be the commute to work. It could be teams deciding not to work, because we had a few technical issues. Yeah. So all of those kind of things fill our buckets. All those little niggles, the getting stuck in traffic, all of those things add to our buckets every single day. And more often than not, we have release recovery strategies that allow us to empty some of that bucket out. That might look like having a conversation with a friend, having an offload, having a vent. It can look like my go-to is to go to the gym and lift weights. That is how I release the tension out of my body. Not everybody's cup of tea, I get that, but it works for me. It might be reading a book, it might be going for a walk. All sorts of things help us in that release and recovery. But if we don't do that release and recovery, what happens is we end up in overflow because the water in is just too much and there is not enough water coming out. The release recovery lets the water out. It's the tap on the side of the bucket that lets the water back out again. If we don't do that release or recovery, or if we don't have effective release and recovery, we end up in overflow. And overflow is where that crisis becomes a place where we react out of proportion. So a little tip at this point, there'll be a few more of these as we go through. A little tip at this point, when you see somebody responding in a way that looks out of character or out of proportion, if you're sitting there kind of going, I have no idea why this person is reacting this way, just take a second to think how full their bucket is. What might be in their bucket, but also consider your own bucket as well. Because self-regulation is a massive part of this, because if we see somebody acting out what we feel is out of proportion, we will often mimic it and do the same ourselves. And that's only going to escalate a crisis situation. So ask yourselves, what's in their bucket? How full is their bucket today? It's a really simple analogy. I use this quite often to help people understand how close they are in terms of crisis themselves as well. So I use this as a way of helping people to understand why they're feeling the way they are. So it's a really, really useful tool. When we're feeling overwhelmed, when that overflow happens, when that crisis situation happens, that can affect how we communicate. And I've deliberately designed this slide to look chaotic. It looks untidy. It doesn't look neat. And that's on purpose. Because when we're in crisis, our communication is the last thing we're thinking about. The only thing we're thinking about is, how do I communicate? I don't feel safe. So we go quiet. We might go into freeze. You might even say, I'm fine. I think it's one of the biggest lies in the UK when somebody says, how are you? I'm fine. Because actually, quite often we're not. But we give that answer because it's the answer that we would like to give people. It's the answer we think is expected. If you get a response from somebody that says, I'm fine, ask twice. Ask a second time. I know you say you're fine. I'm just checking. Are you fine? How are you today? We might be snapping. We might be in a place, like I said, in terms of confusion that you can't process. Crying easily. It's not a weakness to cry. It's often a sign of frustration. It's often a sign of impending crisis. For me, it's a frustration thing. I get so frustrated. We might over-explain. They're all examples of what communication might look like in those challenging situations. So little things to look out for. But it's not always about what the other person's doing. Sometimes it's about what we're doing. And regulation of ourselves is really, really key in terms of communicating well in a crisis. Because sometimes we add pressure without meaning to. There's nobody I've ever spoken to that's ever meant to add pressure to somebody else. In my work as a mediator, most people, once they realise they've had an impact on somebody, they feel so full of remorse and regret. How do I put this right next time? So we often put pressure on without realising. And it's actually quite uncomfortable to think that we are doing this. I know I don't feel comfortable thinking about it. So in those situations, we might pile on more information. We might think somebody's responding that way because we've not given them enough information, so let's give them some more. We might expect instant answers. This is the one that really, really can push me. If I'm feeling a little bit overwhelmed, expecting instant answers. You might pick the wrong moment. I think we've all done that. I think we've all had a conversation with somebody and walked away going, that was not the right time to have that conversation. We might sound blunt, rushed, or dismissive because we're trying to get out what we need to say and we don't always recognise how it lands. We may challenge in front of others. Again, I need to do this now so I don't forget or I don't lose the moment. And actually, that can apply more pressure to somebody. And we might keep pushing when they're already strained. We might even subconsciously recognize that that strain is happening, but we keep pushing because actually we need a response or we need something to happen. And the big one for me is we start to focus on the issue more than the person. We focus so much on the thing we need to know or the thing that we need done that we forget there's actually a person on the other end. So more pressure, confusion, shame and embarrassment, defensiveness, shutdown, escalation, loss of trust, loss of safety. They are all the impacts that sometimes our behaviour has on the moment and somebody else. Because our best intentions don't always create a safe impact. And that's a hard lesson to wrap your head around sometimes. Sometimes you have to walk away from a situation. What could I have done differently? So what is actually going on in those situations? I'm going to go into a little bit of neuroscience here. I'm not sure how much any of this anybody will realise. But the really interesting thing, any crisis is essentially our fight or flight kicking into action. I don't know if anybody's heard the term fight or flight before. Our brains are pesky little things. When we receive information, it goes through the part of the brain called the amygdala. The amygdala is the part of our brain that responds emotionally. It's the survival space in our brain. And what happens when the amygdala gets that information, it has a look at it and goes, yep, that's okay. And the prefrontal cortex responds. That's the logic part of the brain. The problem is when the amygdala sees a piece of information and goes, hang on a minute, I need to set off an alarm here. The prefrontal cortex, the logic part of the brain does not get a chance to respond. The amygdala goes straight into threat mode. And unfortunately, it can't tell the difference between an actual threat and a perceived threat. So regardless of whether you're crossing the road and you see a car coming, or that name drops into your inbox, or you see that number on your phone, your brain will respond the same way. It will go into fight or flight. It'll go into one of the four, it's actually 5 Fs, one of the 4 Fs. So some of those you will have heard of before: fight, aggression, passive aggression, very direct response to a situation. Flight is trying to get away from a situation. So it might be actively walking away. It might be switching off a video in a video call. It might be slamming down the phone. Fawn is people pleasing, saying yes to make the problem go away. That's my default. I say yes to everything. Freeze is shut down. That is the, I don't know what to do, so I'm going to do nothing. And flop is kind of a complete give up. That's the point where the crisis completely takes over and somebody is actually incapable of actually being able to take themselves back to safety. That's probably a point people need some real help. So what can we do in that moment? My trust model is a really, really helpful mnemonic to try and wrap your head around what helps in these situations. And when we use these things, it actively builds trust. So when trust is high, we actually feel safe. When threat is high, trust helps us get back to a place where pressure is reduced, safety is restored, and it supports engagement. And what trust stands for is transparency, respect, understanding, support, and tolerance. Transparency reduces the fear of the unknown, so it actively counteracts freeze, flight, and flop because it makes a situation more predictable. Respect protects dignity and lowers defensiveness, so it actively counteracts fight and fawn by reducing shame, threat, power, and struggle. Understanding helps with all responses. If the world was 1% more curious, there'd be a lot of issues that would resolve themselves overnight if we took the time to understand and be curious, because it shifts us from judgment to curiosity when we seek to understand. Support offers steadiness without taking over, which helps with freeze and flop. And anybody who's in panic, it empowers them, it encourages them to take back control. And the tolerance space is about making space for emotion, silence, and imperfection, which naturally stops people going into fight or flight. It's not a magical formula. I wish it was. There's no such thing as a magical formula, unfortunately. They're just little things that we can take away. So here's some practicalities in terms of what this looks like. So the transparency, these are some things that you can do in order to encourage trust in a conversation that looks like it's heading certainly towards a stressful situation, if not a crisis. So first things first, explain clearly what's happening and what happens next. Reduce that uncertainty by being open, calm, and predictable. And use simple language. Sometimes the simplest questions or the simplest statements can be really, really helpful in these situations because the brain doesn't have quite as much to process. There's clarity there. That's what transparency is about, it's clarity. Respect. This is about speaking with dignity, even when somebody is upset or reactive. This is about speaking from a place of regulation yourself. It's about understanding that what that person is doing or saying probably actually has nothing to do with you. They're reacting to a situation, but unfortunately, in the moment, you're the one in the face of that situation. Respect is also about recognizing that in that moment, their experience is real, even if you're stood there going, I don't understand why that person's reacting that way. For them, it's real. And if it's real to them, that's what matters in that moment. Understanding is often the one we have most struggle with in these situations because our own brains are trying to make sense of what's going on. So we actively go into judgment ourselves. We actively go into a place of survival ourselves because we're trying to make sense of what's going on. So this is about staying out of judgment and being curious instead, which is really, really tough in these situations. Even I, as a mediator for 12 years, struggle to do this. So look beneath behaviour. It's not about excusing it. It's about understanding what might be creating that behaviour. So yes, look at the behaviour, but understand what might be going on underneath. What is in their bucket right now? What is going on for them? And then ask what's driving the response before making assumptions. Our brains make assumptions because it's our fight or flight kicking in to try and keep us safe. So it creates shortcuts to try and keep us safe. And unfortunately, we often act on those assumptions because it's easier sometimes than taking a step back. So the understanding one for me is a really, really key one in these situations. In terms of support, I have a phrase that I say over and over again, calm is contagious. If you remain calm, if you remain in a place that outwardly you look regulated, I know on the inside you probably won't, but on the outside you look calm, you are more likely to generate a calm response from the other person. And if anybody's a fixer who's watching this now, offering steadiness without taking over, not fixing, empowering somebody to think about what comes next themselves by asking, by being curious. And then helping that person find the manageable next step. I call it the 1% forward. What's the 1% that you can do right now? Often when we're in crisis, we get stuck in the big picture. We're trying to look at the whole problem. And there's a phrase that says, how do we eat an elephant one bite at a time? This is the equivalent. What's the 1%? What's the 1% that person can do right now? And that might just literally be a case of, I'm just going to sit down. That might be all they can do in that moment. But what is their 1% forward? And the last one is tolerance. Allow silence, allow emotion. It's okay to allow emotion to live. We often see emotion, and I know before I became a mediator, I used to panic a little bit when I saw emotion. Oh God, I've got to do something to sort this out. And actually, sometimes emotion just needs space to breathe. So resist the urge to judge, correct, or shut the feeling down. Give it space to breathe. Give them space to talk if they want to, or have silence if they don't. And accept that distress may look different from person to person. One person's distress might actually look like somebody else's, curiosity, for example. And we cannot control how someone's nervous system responds, but we can reduce threat and increase safety just by remembering those 5 letters. What can I do to create clarity? How can I leave that person feeling they're respected, even if I don't fully understand why they're feeling the way they are right now? Even if I can't recognize why they're feeling that way right now? How can I stay out of judgment? How can I remain calm and support them and give them space for that emotion to breathe? So on that note, I mentioned there about that person's 1% forward. I want you to take a moment and think about what your 1% forward is. So thinking about the kind of things I've talked about in this last 25 minutes. I know I've covered a lot in the last 25 minutes, but if there's one thing, if there's 1% that you're going to take away from today, what might that be? Please feel free to pop them in the chat if you've got a 1% that really jumps to mind straight away. My biggest 1% was understanding that how that person feels is very real to me. That was the thing that I learned very, very quickly as a mediator. Just because I don't understand it doesn't mean it's not real. That was my 1%. That was the thing I took away. So what is your 1% forward? What's your 1% you're going to do differently the next time somebody seems overwhelmed or shut down or defensive or snappy or hard to reach? What's the 1% you're going to do differently? It might just be slowing down before asking another question. Might just be checking your tone. It's not about perfection. The point is movement forward. And 1% is enough. 1% is enough to take somebody back to safety. Because 1% becomes 2%, becomes 5%. Yeah. It gathers momentum, but we've all got to start somewhere. Yeah. I'm just seeing in the chat now the 1% matters. Yes, it does. Massively matters. Yeah. Understanding without judging. That's a tough lesson because our brains naturally judge. It's part of our survival instinct. As much as the crisis is their survival instinct kicking in, it's also ours as well. Yeah. Don't expect instant answers. Yeah, my husband's a nightmare for expecting an instant answer when I'm going, I just need a minute. Just need a minute to process. Yeah, give them some time. Space is brilliant. Yeah. If anybody's got any others, please feel free to pop them in the chat. I love hearing what everybody's 1% forward is, and I sometimes learn from people as well. So I kind of got to the end of what I was going to cover, which is 2 minutes from the end of time. I don't know if anybody's got any questions in the chat. Just while I'm just giving anybody a chance to pop questions in the chat, or please take yourself off mute if you want to ask any questions or put your hand up. We do have some further training. We do have other things going on in the background. We've got the conference on Thursday. We've got other webinars this week as well. We've got a lot of stuff going on this week. We're all running around trying to deliver everything. So they're just some examples of some of the other training we have as well, including the accredited mental health first aid training and OCN accredited mediation training. Just spotted a question in the chat, which I'm going to come to in a second. But if anybody else has got any questions, please feel free to stick your hand up or just take yourselves off mute. But the question that's in the chat, is it possible to train the amygdala to react less to fight or flight? There is definitely some work we can do in terms of self-awareness, understanding what our triggers are. I'm not a big fan of the word trigger, but understanding what our triggers are, understanding the things that do push us into fight or flight. So, for example, one of the things that I've always struggled with is when somebody cries, I want to run away and hide, or when somebody shouts. So strong emotion from me could, in the past, because of my past experience, would often create a space where I didn't feel safe. So I would go into flight, or I'd go into people pleasing and try and fix it and smooth it over. Through self-awareness work, through counselling work, through coaching work, through just understanding myself a little bit more, I now don't react to those things. I don't see them as threats, but it's taken work to do it. So yes, it is possible, but it does take some work. It doesn't just happen, unfortunately. I wish. Yeah, it doesn't just happen, but yes, you absolutely can. Maybe not train everything out of it because, we need that survival instinct there. But certainly if you've got things that push you into fight or flight very, very quickly and you'd rather they didn't, have a chat with somebody, talk it through, with a coach, with a counsellor, with your best mate. Just talk it through because talking it through helps your brain see it as less of a threat. Yeah. Yeah, you're welcome. No problem at all. Any other questions anybody's got? I'll stop sharing the screen. Any other questions? This is a topic I could talk about all day long, definitely. I see it a lot in conflict. Conflict, everybody perceives as a threat. So it means if you have a disagreement, you quite often end up in a situation where you jump straight into that fight or flight. So that's something to be mindful of as well. But yeah, if there are no questions, we're bang on 1 o'clock, and I'm very mindful of making sure we keep to time. I'm happy to hang about for another couple of minutes if anybody's got any more questions. But thank you for coming. We've got some more sessions this week. Hopefully, I might see some of you at the conference on Thursday, where I'll be talking about neurodiversity. But yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for the comments about about the trust model as well. It's a really, really simple model to keep you straight. So thank you. Thank you for coming.
Hi.
Hello. Somebody's going to ask me a question then.